It's fascinating how the Torah uses structure and language in order to teach us lessons within the narrative of the Torah. In this week's parsha, there's one story that stands out as not fitting within the regular flow of the storyline, and that is the story of Yehuda and Tamar. This week's parsha focuses on Yosef being sold by his brothers down to Egypt and what Yosef does at the beginning of his time in Egypt. The story of Yehuda and Tamar seems to be a total tangent from that main storyline. However, if you look closely at the language that's used, as well as the structure of the parsha, you'll notice something fascinating. This week's parsha is actually built totally on a chiastic structure. A chiastic structure is when the first part of the story and the last part of the story match up, and the second part and the second to last match up, and there's a middle part that seems to be on its own. How is that so? At the beginning of this week's parsha, we have the dreams of Yosef. At the end of this week's parsha are the dreams of the Sarah Mashkim and Sa'ophim. The second part of the story is Yosef being thrown into a bore. Him being loved at the beginning, but being thrown into a pit afterwards. The second to last part of this week's parsha is about Yosef being thrown again into a bore. And the same language is used, which is strange because in the second part of the story, Yosef is actually thrown into jail. But the language that the Torah uses is bore. And we can see that the Torah is trying to line up the beginning of the parsha with the end, and the second part of the parsha with the second to last. Right in the middle, as the centerfold of our parsha, is the story of Yehuda and Tamar. Now, why would that be? What's even more so is you notice that many of the words that are used when Yosef is being thrown into the pit by his brothers are used again by the story of Yehuda and Tamar. Yehuda makes a mistake and goes with Tamar, and he gives her a gdi izim, the same gdi that was used for Yosef in order to prove to the father that that Yosef was killed. Now, what's incredible is the last line when they're about to throw Tamar into the fire and kill her for her treachery. She turns to him and uses a language that hits a chord with Yehuda. She uses the language of hekerna. Notice, do you recognize these items? And all of a sudden, Yehuda strikes a chord. He says, "Wait a second, hekerna. That's the language that I used when I showed the bloody jacket to my father. Hekerna. Do you notice who this is?" And at that point, he says, "Tzadka mimeni." At that point, he realizes, wait a second, she's right. I'm wrong. What's incredible is that he then turns to her, and the pasuk says, "I will no longer be with her. V'lo yasef od ledata." And he will not continue to be with her. But it uses a strange language. The language he uses is Yasof, which sounds like Yosef. In other words, we're connecting this story to the story of Yosef because it is a totally different environment, totally different narrative than that of Yosef being sold. However, Yehuda picks up on the nuances within the story in order to learn the lesson of the wrong that he did to Yosef. And that's the turning point in the story. And I think the message of it is that when you look through life and events happen to you, we can use these events both as just things that are going on in our lives and series of events and part of a story, or you can see every event of your life as a lesson that can be learned. And Yehuda uses this totally different story in order to make it a part of his lesson that he learns about him throwing his brother into the pit, and then we're able to continue on and see how the reconciliation happens in the next parshiot that are coming up. Shabbat Shalom.